The following is a local resident producer's program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Media Services, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everybody, welcome to Eye on Oshkosh. I'm Cheryl Hentz. I'm very pleased to be joined this evening by my co-host, Tony Palmeri. And Tony is responsible tonight for getting our guest here this evening. We're very pleased to be joined by Mike McCabe. He is the former executive director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. He is considered a foremost watchdog for democracy in the state of Wisconsin and a leading whistleblower. And he's written a book called Blue Jeans in High Places, The Coming Makeover of American Politics. And he's also recently started an organization based on that same premise called the Blue Jean Nation. So we've got a lot of things to talk to Mike about this evening. So we're glad you're with us. And Tony, thanks for getting Mike here. And Mike, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
You came up from Madison.
I did.
All right. And you're going to be speaking at the university tonight, right?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Sure. By the time this airs, though, that presentation will be over with, but we're glad you're here. So I wanted to just start out, you were with the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign for a lot of years. What was it, like 14, 15 years?
I was director for 15 years. I was on staff for 16, was involved with the organization since its inception. So for 20 years, I was on the board of directors for a few years, joined the staff in 1999, became director in 2000.
Wow. So what made you leave?
It was a job I loved, and it was not easy to leave. But, you know, to be honest with you, I kind of looked myself in the mirror and asked myself if I did that work for another 15 years, would that alone get us to a better place? And my answer was probably not. Mm-hmm. And I think we're at a point where our political system is sick. Our democracy is in failing health. And we've got to do some things differently. You know, there's that classic definition of insanity that everybody talks about. Do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. And I had to ask myself whether if I did the same thing over and over again for another 15 years, would we get a different result? Or would the health of our political system continue to deteriorate? So I decided we got to try some new things, and I looked myself in the mirror and said, well, that's got to start with me. I've got to try. I've got to be willing to try some new things. And so I've kind of taken a step off a sheer cliff. For the time being, I've given up my source of income. I hope it's a short time being, but you know, for now, I'm doing this work building Blue Jean Nation without pay. Sure. Wow. And that's a leap of faith. That's a big leap of faith. Absolutely. Absolutely. So while you were at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, what do you feel were some of your greater accomplishments? I mean, there were a lot, to be sure, but you have a few in mind that you can... Well, you know, we had some legislative victories over the years. You know, we got an ethics reform bill passed back in 2007. We were able to get a earlier legislation called the Citizens' Right to Know law passed. We got a paper trail law passed requiring any electronic voting machine to be able to produce a verifiable paper record. We got something called the Impartial Justice Act that for a short period of time before they repealed it provided public financing for state Supreme Court elections. So we had a string of victories in the legislative arena, but some of those victories ended up later being repealed. And so we felt the exhilaration of of getting some wins only to watch those wins taken away from us. To me, though, the biggest thing that we did over the years was build this database of donors to allow the public to be able to follow the money, and it passed the 1 million donor mark, where
Wow.
1 million records of donations, and people can use that online database free of charge to see who's giving to whom. And to me, that was our biggest accomplishment and our most important contribution to the public.
And people can find that database at wisdc.org.
Yep. To this day, that's our bread and butter. That's what the Democracy Campaign, I think, is best known for, is that database on the WDC website.
Speaking about the repealing of accomplishments, though, one thing that you were a strong advocate for was the Government Accountability Board, which has been nationally recognized as a success, yet it seems like the Republican legislature wants to repeal that. Can you explain to us what the Government Accountability Board is and why are they trying to overturn it?
Well, we were in the midst of an ethics scandal in Wisconsin politics around 2000, 2001. We had a number of top legislative leaders who ended up being criminally charged with misconduct in office. Many of them were convicted. Some even did some jail time. And at the time, we had a state elections board and a state ethics board that were basically juries of the politicians' pals.
Right.
They were appointed by the top legislative leaders, the governor, the two major political parties, and they put people in place who were looking the other way. And there wasn't strong enforcement of campaign finance and ethics laws, and that ended up leading to a corruption scandal. And so our view was that we needed a much more independent, nonpartisan agency to serve as a public watchdog and to take enforcement action and to make these laws have teeth again. And the creation is known as the Government Accountability Board, and the ironic thing is that Ohio State University has held it up as a national model. You've got all these people across the country saying this is the best model of nonpartisan election administration and ethics enforcement and campaign finance law enforcement. This is a national model that all the other states should replicate.
It's got retired judges that hear the ethics cases, right?
We've got retired judges who are prohibited by law from making partisan campaign contributions or belonging to parties or having special interest involvement. They make the decisions about whether laws have been broken or not, and they make decisions about how to administer elections. And so it's been heralded from coast to coast as a wonderful system, and here we've got lawmakers trying to either get rid of it entirely or at least try to neuter it.
Why?
I think they would prefer to have the old model where they get to handpick the people who are overseeing their activities, and I think then presumably they would get gentler treatment from the enforcement officials.
Wow.
And so I think the public would be better served to have an independent, nonpartisan agency with some teeth, but the politicians, I think, look at it as an annoyance.
Cheryl, should we start talking about the book? Or
Well, I mean, I just wanted to make a comment about that. It's kind of the same thing with campaign finance reform. We make a few steps forward, and then the current legislature and governor just kind of take a few steps back, undo some things that have been done, and now it seems like it's almost harder than ever to have true democracy with a small d, if you will, and greater transparency. We're just not seeing that.
Well, we've in Wisconsin, we've gone to a point where money is not only flowing freely, and we've had the two most recent elections for governor, we've seen spending of about $80 million in those elections. So we're seeing money flowing very freely, but increasingly we're also seeing it flow secretly. And we're seeing huge donations, 6-figure, sometimes 7-figure donations being made that are being cloaked. And one very recent example was John Menard
Just gonna talk about
giving a huge donation to an interest group known as Club for Growth. That transaction could have been and would have been entirely secret. It would have been totally in the dark if we weren't in the midst of this John Doe criminal investigation, and that's where it was brought to light. It wasn't brought to light because it was reported on some campaign finance report. It wasn't brought to light because of our campaign finance laws. So you can only imagine how many of these transactions are going on that don't happen to get caught up in a criminal investigation and come out in court. And so there's this enormous problem with dark money now in Wisconsin politics. And so it's not only a lot of money, but it's also money that is flowing very secretly. None of that serves the public interest.
No.
What we're losing is what the founders designed for us. In the Federalist Papers, it was written that we should have a government dependent on the people alone. Those were the words, dependent on the people alone. Today's elected officials are not dependent on the people alone, or at least all the people. They're highly dependent. Their political futures are highly dependent on a very small number of donors. We tracked all that money, 1 million records in our database. If you total up all the donors in that database, they amount to not quite 2% of Wisconsin's population.
And they come from a certain small set of zip codes, right?
They do, highly concentrated. So many of the donors come from just a handful of zip codes. It's very clustered in certain parts of our state, and so that really creates conditions where the interests and the voices of an awful lot of people in many parts of our state can be ignored by elected officials.
Right. Well, and corporations, under our current government system, are considered people. Yes, they're run by people, but they're not in and of themselves people. And I think that is just a huge travesty in and of itself. And that's one of the things that's getting us into the problems.
And I think it's an important distinction to make. The people who work for those corporations, they're citizens and they have rights and they can vote. But the things themselves, the corporations, the things themselves are now treated as having citizenship rights.
Right.
And they can put unlimited amounts of money into political campaigns, and that, of course, wasn't the case in Wisconsin for well over 100 years. And that has had a huge impact on our politics and has led us to a point where that I would characterize as a political market failure. I think we are living in the midst of a political market failure where the political marketplace is broken.
Right.
And as citizens, we got to figure out how to get out of that mess.
Well, and that's a good transition to your book. Mike has written the book Blue Jeans in High Places. It came out in late 2014, I believe, at around the same time that you were leaving the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Where can people get the book?
Well, it was published by a Wisconsin-based publisher called Little Creek Press, and so littlecreekpress.com is one place where you can order it online. It's available on Amazon. It's available in a number of bookstores, or bookstores can at least order it and get it for people. Right. But you can get it directly from the publisher, which is based in Mineral Point, Little Creek Press.
Support the small publisher, which is a good way to take on some of the big corporate bigwigs.
A lot of people go to Amazon, and it's easy, but it's also possible to support a very small, independent, Wisconsin-based company. And so I really encourage people to go to littlecreekpress.com.
All right, littlecreekpress.com. Let's talk about the book a little bit. In the first chapter, you talk about growing up in Clark County, northwest of Oshkosh, I would guess, and it's significant in that it's classic Wisconsin dairy land. It's got more cows than people, right? About 60,000 cows and 30,000 people.
Correct.
Give or take.
Correct.
And in your chapter, you kind of identify Clark County as symbolic of almost everything that's wrong with politics in our state and maybe even nationally. So what's the matter with Clark County?
Clark County has been forgotten. It's been ignored. It's one of those places that isn't producing all the campaign donations,
right.
and so elected officials don't have a whole lot of reasons in this current money-saturated environment to care very much about the concerns of communities in Clark County or do much of anything to address those concerns. And what that's done to people in places like Clark County is really driven them to become exceedingly anti-government. And you know, the ironic thing is that, you know, when I was growing up, for example, Clark County was sending Democrats to the state capitol to represent them. When the 2014 election, my hometown of Curtis, which is a little town of about 150 people, voted 90% for Scott Walker. And so a lot of people would look at that and say, you know, Clark County is bright red. It's solid Republican country. But, you know, I remember a time when they were sending Democrats, and one of the Democrats that they used to send to the Capitol was a guy named Frank Nicolay. I don't think there's ever been a more progressive, more liberal elected official in the state capitol than Frank Nicolay. He was a Bob La Follette progressive.
Sure.
He was... and he was representing Clark County. So Clark County has gone through this real transformation politically, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that people there feel as though their concerns are absolutely ignored. And I think why I would describe Clark County as sort of stereotypical of what's gone haywire is that so many people in our country don't believe their voices are being heard. They don't believe their votes really are making a difference. They don't think their interests are being served. They don't feel represented.
Right.
And they actually have very good reasons for feeling that way. And that's poisonous. That is a condition that produces the kind of resignation and withdrawal from public life that we're seeing. And I just saw the other day new Pew research that said that it's been 3/4 of a century since such a high percentage of Americans couldn't bring themselves to identify either as Democrats or Republicans. The book is really about the growing ranks of the politically homeless, people who feel abandoned. And then the book is really about how we get citizens back in the driver's seat of our government at a time when both major parties are failing us. And trying to borrow from lessons from past generations where they were successful in making change under similar conditions.
But for those 90% in town of Curtis,
yeah,
that are voting for Scott Walker, what are they not seeing in Democrats? And what are they seeing in Scott Walker?
Well, you know, my dad was a dairy farmer. He had an 8th grade education. He was not a worldly man in a book sense,
right,
but, you know, lived through the Depression, fought in World War II, had an awful lot of important life experience. My dad, his politics were really shaped by FDR and the Depression and the New Deal. And he could give you a list of 12 ways or 24 ways that Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats had made his life better, had rescued his family, had made his community able to survive. And you know, he would talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration and those Depression-era programs. And of course, he went off to World War II, and the GI Bill was waiting for him when he got home. And you know, rural electrification, people don't realize how that revolutionized rural life. We've all forgotten it. We take electricity for granted. But getting electricity to every house and every barn wasn't something that any electric company was going to do. They were not going to string that wire to get a few extra customers. That took a national effort.
Right. Exactly.
And the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, made that happen. And then, of course, the interstate highway system. People sort of forget how that opened markets to farmers who couldn't possibly hope to reach those markets before the interstate system was built. All those things were things that politicians like Frank Nicolay were for.
Yeah.
And that they worked for. And people could see how their lives were being changed. So when I talk to Democratic audiences, I say, name me the modern day equivalent. Name me today's equivalent of the WPA or the CCC or the REA or the Interstate Highway System or the GI Bill. And today's Democrats have a hard time coming up with what those modern day equivalents are. Well, people in Clark County aren't stupid. They recognize that, and they feel like if government's not going to do much for us, if they're kind of going to abandon our communities, then we just should keep government as small as possible, and their default option becomes the Republican Party.
Oh, okay.
And so that's their calculus.
So then the Republican Party ends up really doing nothing for them.
And I think so, they've accepted for the time being that nothing is going to be done for them.
Okay.
So they might as well just keep the government as small as possible, and they think the Republicans will do a better job of that.
I gotcha.
So I don't even think it's that they're expecting anything to be done for them, because they've grown convinced that that's not going to happen, because all the money is going to go to the cities, all the money are going to go to a wealthy few. It's not going to if they send their taxes to Madison or to Washington, it's not going to come back to them. And that has really changed their political outlook. And I keep hearing people say that they're stupid and voting against their own interests, but they're voting for their interests as they see their interests. And I think Democrats have got to come to terms with the way they see their interests and make them a better offer. And political realignment happens from time to time.
Yeah.
They used to vote for Democrats in Clark County. Now they're heavily voting Republican. Those things change over time.
Right.
Just a couple of points before we move on to other things in the book. One thing, Mike, you talk about how the better majority of Americans don't feel like our government is doing anything for us. And I'm one of those who, I think they're doing something for us, but sometimes I wonder why they're doing what they're doing. Some people feel that people are getting so upset with the government that there will eventually be another civil war. I don't know that I subscribe necessarily to that dramatic of a possibility, but what do you think about that, since so many people feel somewhat disenfranchised?
The ranks of the politically homeless are larger than they've been in our lifetimes. People's sense of alienation or frustration with the political system is at levels we haven't seen in living memory. That's not a sustainable condition. It eventually has to produce some kind of change. Now, there have been moments in American history when that change came through great suffering and tremendous turmoil and even things rising to the level of civil war. Other times there have been citizen movements that have driven change that ended up being far more peaceful change. But look, a lot of people marched and fought and in some cases died trying to make our society more just. And we're reaching a point where I think the conditions are so eerily reminiscent of those from a time before any of us was on this earth, that I think we are reaching a very important crossroads, and we're going to have to come to terms with how broken the political system is right now, and how both parties are failing us in very significant ways. And I'm not, by the way, I'm not one of those people who suggests that the two parties are exactly the same, or that there's just one party and we've got two wings of the same party. I actually think the parties are very distinctly different, but they are both failing us. They're failing us in different ways, but they are failing us, and that's not sustainable. You can't have a political system that leaves most people feeling left out and ignored and unrepresented for very long. And what I think is that citizens have to then get busy and build a force powerful enough to make the political establishment change its ways.
Well, the Tea Party certainly did it, and now you've got Blue Jean Nation. How would you liken it to the Tea Party?
Well, the interesting thing, I have to confess that I started thinking about all of this, and I was inspired to write this book because of the Tea Party movement. The thing that fascinated me about the Tea Party movement is that it wasn't a party at all. It was a brand that was being used to take over one of the major parties. And so I started looking into the Tea Party and its origins, and what I found were the Koch brothers, the heads of Koch Industries. And one of the Koch brothers was once on a presidential ticket. He was the vice presidential nominee of the Libertarian Party in 1980, running against Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, they didn't think was subservient enough to their interests, And one of the Koch brothers ran as a libertarian. They lost miserably. And I think a light bulb went on for the Kochs at that moment. They realized it doesn't matter how much money you've got, it doesn't matter what your name is. If you run outside this two-party system, it doesn't end well. And what I found is that they spent 10 years planning the development and the launching of the Tea Party. It wasn't a spontaneous grassroots uprising. It was planned for over a decade. And again, it wasn't a party at all. It was a brand used to take over a party. And you have to admit, the Tea Party movement has made the Republican Party way more subservient to interests like Koch Industries than it was previously.
Sure.
And that got me to thinking, well, if they could do that, couldn't ordinary citizens use the same sort of strategy for a much more public-spirited, less selfish purpose? Well, then as I look back in history, I realized ordinary citizens have done that in the past. They've done exactly that. And I describe it in the book as a first-party movement rather than a third-party movement. That the goal should be to, in a two-party system, to try to create conditions where at least one of the parties is willing to change its ways and start to actually do the will of the people. And then I offer some recipes about how that might be done. But the thinking really did start because of what the Tea Party has done to the Republican Party.
Sure.
Well, speaking of the two parties, you say in the book, and this has been quoted, I think, extensively, you say that, speaking of the Republicans and Democrats, we have one party that is scary and the other that is scared. What do you mean by that?
The funny thing about that line is it appears in the book a number of times, and I've also used it at every presentation I've given around the state, and there have been dozens and dozens, and I've yet to be asked by anybody in any audience which one's which. People instinctively know which party is which. The reason I would characterize the Republican Party as a scary party is that this was the party of Lincoln. It was the party of Teddy Roosevelt. It was the party of Dwight Eisenhower. The Republican Party was a party dedicated to creating opportunity for all. And it is now a party devoted to serving the rich. And to me, that is a scary party that has become so slavishly beholden to a privileged few, and they're working to serve a privileged few at the expense of the many. And that is, to me, a scary party. Now, one of the reasons the Republican Party has become increasingly scary and has moved away from its roots as a party of Lincoln and of Teddy Roosevelt and of Dwight Eisenhower is that it has such feeble opposition. And the Democratic Party has basically been telling candidates for years to play it safe, to sort of run issue free. Don't take controversial stands. Don't say anything that might ruffle feathers. And they haven't offered an agenda that is close to as ambitious as what FDR and Frank Nicolay were offering. Right. They aren't trying to. They haven't offered a modern day equivalent of rural electrification or the interstate highway system or the GI Bill or the Depression era programs that pulled the country out of economic catastrophe. They've just decided to be an incredibly cautious party.
But is it because they became corporate?
I think one of the huge roots of the problem is the problem of money in politics. Yeah. They also get money from less than 2% of the population, and they feel the need to cater to those donors, and those donors don't have the same interests as the rest of the population. The few who have such a stranglehold on our government and our political process, they have very different interests than the many, than the masses, and so the Democrats don't feel at liberty to do what the whole of society wants done, because they are also trying to cater to a very small donor class. That's a huge problem, and I think it's made the Democrats incapable of actually acting on what they say they believe in.
Right.
They say that they're for a lot of things that they never actually do. And to me, that's a scared party. When a party is afraid to actually do what they say they believe in, that's the definition of a scared party, and that's the condition that the Democrats are in. That has actually made the Republicans able to become increasingly scary. And so that's why I say both parties are failing us. They're not failing us in the same way, but one party's failure actually contributes to the other's failure, and that's a condition that I think leaves so many people feeling like they are doomed to hold their noses and choose between the lesser of evils when it comes to voting, and a lot of people just decide, you know what, I'm heading to the sidelines.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna withdraw.
Right, and that's why we have such great voter apathy.
Yep.
You know, we just had an election here a couple days ago, and I didn't happen to see what the voter turnout was, but it was an apathetic. It was really kind of a disgrace in that we hardly had anybody running. We had 3 open seats on the city council, 3 people running. 4 people running for school board, 1 who dropped out, and 3 open seats. I mean, so basically everybody who ran, actively campaigned, got elected. So in a case like that, what's the motivation for anyone to go to the polls?
Right.
You know, and I thought that too, walking up to my precinct thinking, why am I even here? You know, but I'm there because it's important, and I try to vote in every single election. But I want to just talk about the parties for a minute. You know, I'm a person who believes, like I think many people do, that we should just do away with the parties altogether, have a one-party system, and be done with it. But if we're not going to do that, and I don't see that happening anytime soon, maybe you can explain to me, Mike, because I truly don't know the answer. Why is it that when we have campaigns, we have you know, debates and so forth? Now, Tony has ran in the past, and he's run as a Green Party candidate. You never see a Green Party candidate in a debate. You never see a moderate in a debate. You never see a you know, any of the other ones in any of the debates. It's just the Democrats and the Republicans. How in the hell is anyone else supposed to get their message across if you don't give them the same platform that you're giving others?
Well, you know, America has a system that very rigidly enforces a two-party arrangement. We're not a parliamentary democracy. We don't have a system like some of the European countries where competing factions can join forces and form coalition governments, where a second and a third or a fourth party could actually join together and become the ruling party or the ruling coalition of a country. We don't have that. We don't have any of the mechanisms that would allow third parties to compete effectively. We don't have fusion voting. We don't have instant runoff voting. We don't have proportional representation. We don't have any of those legal mechanisms. And so we have a system that discriminates in favor of the 2 major parties. The 2 major parties then use that favored status to then further discriminate against other kinds of candidates, freezing them out of debates and doing all, kind of sort of using their strength, their favored status, to then freeze out any other competition. So that's actually what got me to thinking about all of this, looking at the Tea Party. One of the Koch brothers had tried a third-party path and failed miserably. Then they decided, you know what, we just got to go and take over the Republican Party. And they started running people in Republican primary elections, and they started knocking off mainstream Republicans with this new brand that had people stirred up and excited. And they have very much transformed the Republican Party. Now, you know, I think they've made it in a party that is increasingly subservient to the interests of people like the Koch family and the Walton family of Walmart fame. But you have to hand it to them. They adopted a strategy that enabled them to maximize their influence over the system. And what fascinates me is that past generations, some of our grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, actually were part of movements that did the same thing, but for a much more public-spirited purpose, and that was much more grounded in an interest in promoting the common good. And so, what I suggested is let's stop thinking about third-party movements and let's start thinking about what I call first-party movements. And there are some fundamental differences. Third parties have a goal of having 3 or more parties. A first-party movement has a goal of having at least one party that's worth a damn, at least one party that will work for the people. Another key difference is that third parties tend to operate on the fringes, to the left of the Democrats or to the right of the Republicans. First-party movements, successful ones, compete for the affections of all voters. They compete for the mainstream. And when change has come in the past, it has been transformation within a two-party system. And when the smoke cleared, we didn't have 3 parties or 4 or 5. We had 2, but those parties had been transformed.
Although, wouldn't you not agree, Mike, that a lot of the ideas that we now take for granted, Social Security, unemployment insurance, women's rights, those ideas all started in third parties?
They did. They did. And I think what I'm suggesting is that, and one of the instances I write about that I describe as a first-party movement was the birth of the Republican Party. At the time, there were 2 major parties, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. Both were for slavery. You had this growing abolitionist movement that wanted to end slavery. They started calling themselves Republicans. You could describe that as a third-party movement, but I think the interesting thing is that when the smoke cleared, there weren't 3 parties. The Whig Party had actually been driven to extinction by this new brand. So very much like the Tea Party did, the Republicans fashioned this new identity, built this movement, and they actually drove a party to extinction. And so we still had 2 parties. But you're right. Oftentimes it's been reform movements, progressives, populists, Republicans, who fashioned themselves a new political identity, sort of built a new household that people would want to live in, and used that to drive change within the two-party system. So regardless of what people choose to call themselves, I think the distinction is whether they want to forever operate outside of the two-party arrangement and they want to keep a separate ballot status, or do they want to attack parties that are failing us directly within the two-party system. And so it's really a strategic distinction.
So you keep mentioning the word rebranding, and I guess the rebranding that you're suggesting in your book, and it's in the title, is the blue jean. So talk about this. Are you talking about like we could have blue jean Republicans and blue jean Democrats?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
What does it mean?
Well, the idea of blue jeans as an identity came after a lot of experimentation. I confess that for the longest time, as I was experimenting with new political labels or new political identities, I would go out and talk to people all around the state. I stuck to animals for the longest time because we have the donkey and the elephant, and so I stuck with animals. And there was nothing that sort of unified people or that people could relate to in rural areas and urban areas. And finally it dawned on me, why does it even have to be an animal?
Right.
And I was talking at the state convention of the Wisconsin Farmers Union, so I was talking to 250 farmers, and I was speaking without notes, and I really don't even know why I did this, but I looked out at these 250 farmers and I said, how many of you own a donkey? And much to my surprise, not a single hand goes up. And I said, come on, some of you still must have a donkey on your land, and apparently nobody did. And I said, oh, all right, how many of you own an elephant? And of course, no hands go up.
Right.
And I said, all right, now how many of you own a pair of blue jeans? And every single person raised their hand. And I said, now, what better represents you? What better symbolizes you as a people? A donkey, an elephant, or a pair of blue jeans? And what better distinguishes you from the suits on Capitol Hill and on Wall Street and on K Street where all the lobbyists hang out? What better distinguishes you from the suits that are lording over us?
Right.
A donkey, an elephant, or a pair of blue jeans? And the reaction I got from that audience inspired the title of the book. But I've talked on college campuses, I've talked in our biggest cities, I've talked in our smallest towns, and blue jeans seems to be a unique common symbol that all of us can relate to, and it seems to be something that is one of those rare things that is sort of a uniquely American and very common. A common aspect of our lives. Everybody's got them.
Right, and the blue jean concept is used very cleverly on your website. And I want to make certain in our remaining time that we get that website address up as frequently as possible without overdoing it and killing people with the website address. But I do want to make sure that people have a chance, there it is, to go to it, because I was looking around on it in preparation for the show. And it really is, you know, the blue jean concept, like I said, is very well done, and it's used throughout. And it's just, it's a very nicely done website. It tells exactly what it is you're about and what you're trying to do. And I didn't notice, though, is there a link on there to get the book? There
is actually a page on the website the page is called Book of the Nation. And the group's called Blue Jean Nation, but then there's information about the book. But people can find information about the book on bluejeannation.com, but they also could go to the publisher, Little Creek Press. Yeah.
Well, flesh out the brand for us a little bit. So if you had people that were calling themselves Blue Jean Democrats or Blue Jean Republicans, what would that mean? How would that separate them from the standard Democrats and Republicans?
Well, you know, one of the things that we have on the website is 5 aims of Blue Jean Nation, and one is to create a first party that is neither elephant nor ass, that is dedicated to actually serving the whole of society and not just a privileged few. So I think one of the real key themes that is underneath Blue Jean Nation is really fighting privilege.
Okay.
The fact that we've got a few that are lording over the rest of us, and that the whole of society is not being well served by our political system because elected officials are so busy catering to a few.
Yeah, you called this the stilted age, right?
Yeah.
Unlike the 19th century gilded age where you had the robber barons who ran things. Now you say we have the stilted age, which
you basically have a few elevated above the rest of us as if they're up on stilts, and
the 1%.
And you know, and we're living through a period with historic levels of wealth and income inequality, and so I think we start with the goal of party transformation, and then of course another key aim is an actual democracy, and that requires the ending of legal bribery. Wisconsin outlawed bribery in 1897. Now, we became a state in 1848. That means for the first half century of statehood, it was perfectly legal to bribe public officials.
Literally legal.
Literally legal to bribe public officials. And it was finally outlawed in 1897. But what has happened now? But a new form of legal bribery has grown up around us. They call them campaign contributions now, but it's really legal bribery, and we have to bring an end to legal bribery. Great change happened politically when bribery was ended in 1897.
Yeah.
And we now have a new form of legal bribery, and great change in our political system will not come until we address that. A third aim is creating one economy for all, and you know, a free market instead of a politically manipulated market. We don't have a free market economy. We have a highly politically manipulated market where a few have been able to rig the rules in their favor, again, at the expense of the many, and we've got to deal with that. We have to create a pathway to the American dream for future generations, and that has to be a central aim as well. And you know, so I think really when you look at these aims and you look at what the common threads that run through all of them, it really is about addressing political privilege, where a few are able to lord over the rest of society, and they're able to be fed, and they're able to get a lot while others have their interests and their needs ignored. And that's really what's at the heart of Blue Jean Nation. And both parties are caught up in a game, a money game, that has rendered them incapable of doing that.
Let me ask you this question. The governor was famously caught on tape expressing a divide and conquer strategy, right? What would you say to the argument that the people are too easily divided for what you're suggesting to actually take place?
Well, we've been trained to think and talk about politics in ways that make us active participants in our own disempowerment.
Exactly.
We've been conditioned to use vocabulary and to think and talk about politics in ways that does divide people who could and should be united. And I actually write about that in the book, and one of the central ideas behind Blue Jean Nation is to get us to stop thinking horizontally. Who's on the left, who's on the right, who's liberal, who's conservative. If you flip that horizontal spectrum up on its head and think vertically and think about who's on top and who's on the bottom, who are the royals of American politics and who are the commoners, a magical thing happens. You actually have an opportunity to unite people who currently see themselves as political enemies. And I think that's critical. We've actually got vocabulary that is dividing and conquering us. It is making us active participants in our own disempowerment. And what fascinates me about what past generations did, every time they made landscape-altering political change, they started by changing their political identity, by fashioning themselves a new identity, shedding old labels, shedding old vocabulary, coming up with new things to call themselves and new ways to talk about politics. I just refuse to believe that there's something different about us or wrong with us today that makes us less capable of that kind of change than past generations. We're more educated, we got more money, we got way more means of communication than they did, and yet they were able to shed old labels, fashion new identities, and transform politics. And I think that's what we need to do today.
But don't you think, Mike, that the major parties, the establishment parties, will fight like heck?
Of course.
That's what you're saying. And let me give you one example. After Act 10, we had the recall movement in Wisconsin. And I think the people, the hundreds of thousands of people that went to Madison were, I think, people that would be very comfortable with the blue jean identity. But didn't it seem that the establishment Democratic Party tried to co-opt it and then turned it into this mainstream candidacy of Tom Barrett? And before you know it, all the energy of the blue jeans was frustrated and disappointed?
Political change, if history is any guide, does not come from political establishments.
Right.
Real political change does not come from Washington, D.C. It doesn't come from Madison. It doesn't come from a political establishment. Party leaders will not offer that leadership.
No.
Real change has always been citizen-driven. It has always come from plain people. And that's where change will come again. And it will be resisted and it will be fought with great tenacity by establishment figures for as long as they can possibly hold out.
But you seem to be suggesting in the book, I mean, you're not insistent on the blue jean identity, right? You say it could be something else, right?
Could be, sure.
All right, but let's assume it's the blue jean. You would ultimately like to see a situation in which candidates run for office in Republican primaries as blue jean Republicans and in Democratic primaries as blue jean Democrats. Is that kind of what you'd like to see?
I think that when people start to get excited about voting again,
right,
it will be when they look at a ballot and they say, wow, there's actually a choice. There's the mainstream politician that the two major parties will offer up, but then there's something else that feels more like what I want.
Yeah.
And we keep blaming voters for being apathetic and for not caring and for not voting. And, you know, are there people out there who are totally unplugged and just don't care and aren't paying attention? Yeah. But I think most people I run into, including most non-voters I run into, actually know quite a bit about what's going on. They're pretty well informed. They care deeply. They just don't think that their vote's going to make a difference.
Right.
And I think change will come when they look at a ballot and say, now, I like the looks of that. And I could get excited about that. And if and whatever the identity ends up being, you know, there was a time where there were populists.
Right.
And then eventually it was progressives. And it ended up being the progressive identity that kind of took, that sank roots. But so whether it's, if blue jeans is a unifying symbol that people can rally around and it can help pull people together who now see each other as enemies, and it can lead to a ballot that gets people excited again about participating, then great. If it's some other symbol or identity that can attach itself to an agenda that is about putting plain people back in the driver's seat of our government,
right,
more power to them. But we've got to get to a situation where the two parties aren't able to offer up options that many, if not most, voters feel are pretty pathetic.
Right.
Options where they feel like, okay, I can vote, but I'm going to have to hold my nose and choose between what I regard as the lesser of evils. People are sick of that. And you're a great citizen for saying, I got to vote in every election, and that's my mentality too. I've got to, you know, it's my duty. I have to go vote because it's election day. But I walk in there sometime and I look at that ballot and I say, why am I bothering? What am I doing here? And I can hardly blame people who've chosen to stay home. You know, we've got to create a more compelling option for people.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I want to drive people to your website, because the motto or mission, if you will, of Blue Jean Nation is commoners working to house the politically homeless and transform parties that are failing America. And I think that says it all. Now, unless you're uber rich, I don't know why anyone would not want to become part of this movement in some shape, form, or fashion. Because this speaks to the better majority of our population.
You know, you start conversations with people and you say, we're neither elephant nor ass. And that opens a door to conversations that otherwise can get closed. Because, you know, somebody says I'm a Democrat. And for a part of the population, they just say, I don't want to hear any more.
Right.
Or if they say, I'm a Republican. And the other part of the population says, I don't want to hear any more. Because people are really feeling that both parties are failing us. And I think if we start the conversation with people from that starting point, that, okay, let's accept that the parties are failing us, that the system is pretty fouled up. Now, what do we do about it? I think that it at least has the promise of getting people to re-engage.
And that's why I find it so sad and disheartening that we can't seem to get some of these other parties into the debates.
Yep.
Because so many people do feel like the parties are failing us.
Yep.
Democrats feel like their party's failing them, as you just said. Republicans feel the same way about their party in many cases. And so if there's that many people who are dismayed by what they see going on and happening, why are they not fighting more to get these other candidates from other parties into debates so we can hear some newer ideas?
Well, all I know is that if you got a couple of options. If you don't like what things look like, you can just sort of sit on your couch and bellyache about it, or you can try something new. And to me, this could fail. There's no question about it. I may not be a skillful enough organizer. I may not have the right kind of symbol. There's all kinds of reasons why it might not take. But to me, the alternative of doing nothing is unacceptable. Because we're in a situation where the system is pretty sick. And I think you've got to try something new. And I'm okay if it fails, if it inspires somebody else to come up with a better path to success.
Right.
Sure.
You know, we've just got to try some different things, and this is you know, what we've come up with is this idea of Blue Jean Nation and you know, building some housing for the politically homeless and trying
Sure.
to transform parties that are failing us, and just we need people to decide that they're ready to get in and fight again.
Sure. We're down to about 3 minutes, and I want to give Tony a chance to ask one last question about the book or something else.
Well, just that in part of the book, you say that we really need to have some redistricting reform. How critical is that for what you're talking about?
Well, you know, the way they've drawn districts to basically, you know, make it a foregone conclusion which party's going to hold a
Exactly.
seat, that is one of the many factors that is putting our democracy in sort of on life support. It's a cancer that's growing in the body of democracy. But you know, it's what parties do when they want to cement their grip on power. You know, we need redistricting reform. We need districts that are drawn much more fairly by some nonpartisan,
Right.
independent entity, so that they're fair district lines and so that you have competitive races where either party could win. We need that. But really, the way we'll get there is when people in supposedly exclusively Republican districts, when they start to vote for the other party
Right.
because they get fed up with that party.
Right.
That's what's going to actually produce change. And
Okay.
and you see that realignment. You saw it in Clark County. They voted for Democrats for years. Now now it's 90% for Walker and the Republicans. Even in districts that are basically rigged in favor of one party, when people decide that they are fed up with what's going on, they start to realign and they start to behave differently. And again, it's up to citizens to make that happen. And that's how we'll get out of this.
Okay.
Can you give us, in about 2 minutes, a real quick checklist or a laundry list, if you will, of how we go about making these changes?
I think, first of all, people, they have to get comfortable with the idea of thinking and talking differently about politics and using different vocabulary. And then if they can do that, they need to think about embracing a new identity. And just stop calling themselves Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives, and embrace a new identity. If they can do that, then it really is about taking this down to the neighborhood level, knocking on doors, making phone calls, talking to neighbors, inviting people over to their homes, and slowly but surely building that capacity at the local level. And out of that will come candidates who are representative of those neighborhoods and those communities, and they will start to challenge establishment politicians, and that's where the change really starts to make a difference. Once you start to see these movements start to produce candidates that are representative of those movements, that's what creates the threat to the political establishment that will force that establishment to change its ways.
Okay. Do you have any candidate in mind?
Not at all. I think this has got to be, that has to be an organic product of all of those neighborhood and community level gatherings of people. When people pull together, those candidates should come out of those neighborhoods, out of those communities.
Well, people should go to Blue Jean Nation on Facebook, and I think they'll see a lot of people participating that should be candidates or could be
The name of the book
candidates.
is Blue Jeans in High Places by Mike McCabe, and you can also go to bluejeannation.com. Mike, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a real pleasure. Love
Thanks
to have
so
you back again sometime.
I'd love to do it. Thank you.
Tony, thanks for bringing him on board, and thanks for hosting tonight, too. Thanks to the crew, and of course, always to you as well. So we will see you next time. Until then, take care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.